Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? As long as you don't look too closely at the reflection staring back at you, because something is not right. The shadow in the mirror doesn't move when you move, the one behind you does. It looks like your own personal evil twin, but it's not actually there at all. So where could it be? How do we know it isn't inside of us? It was the kind of day where even the birds had flown home to watch their favorite TV shows. So Maya was on her own at the art studio. She was attempting to paint a portrait of her friend Lena, but it wasn't going well. Maya sighed. She was so frustrated, she almost smashed the canvas into the sink. Almost, then she caught sight of herself in the mirror on the wall above the sink. Why can't I get this right? She raised her paintbrush in the air. In the reflection, the paintbrush went up, but the hand holding it stayed put. The shadow in the mirror moved independently of her. Maya stared, dumbfounded, then reached out a finger to touch the cold glass. When Maya turned away from the mirror, she could see her shadow still standing there, frozen mid-gesture. It seemed to belong to another world, a world where she was trapped and couldn't escape. But now she doubted she would ever find her way out of the looking glass. What happened to Maya, and how can we tell if something similar might happen to us? Let's take a closer look. As far back as ancient Greek and Roman times, people have told stories about people getting trapped in mirrors or paintings or photographs. A character from a story by Washington Irving, published in 1835, over time. The tale has been adapted many times and has inspired everything from fairy tales for children to horror films for adults. One version of the story is called The Looking Glass by author George MacDonald. In this telling, the main character steps into a looking glass, leaving our world for another similar but different one. He becomes friends with a talking tree and rides a winged horse, visits a magical land full of strange creatures before returning home just as he disappeared. In fact, the idea of falling into a mirror seems to have captured the imagination of humanity for centuries. In reality, we know that if you fall into a mirror, you won't end up in some fantasy realm. Well, except for those few cases of people being cut by shards of glass, of course. But even if you somehow managed to fall into a mirror without hurting yourself, you wouldn't be greeted by a beautiful princess or an alternate dimension. You'd simply tumble onto the floor on the other side of the glass, maybe scraping your knees and definitely getting some glass in your hair. But what about the shadow in the mirror? We've all seen our reflections dancing in shop windows or moving with us through the mall. In fact, that's what they're supposed to do. A mirror reflection is created by light waves bouncing off the glass and then entering our eyes. Because of this, the image seems to exist outside of us. But it's actually only visible because of how our brains process visual input. So if you were to remove the mirror, the reflection would cease to exist. At least that's how it normally works. For example, if you closed the door to the art studio, Maya's reflection would disappear until she opened the door again. But she saw her reflection in a bathroom, which means the room was likely small enough for the mirror to be tiled all the way around, leaving no gaps for light to enter and create an image. In other words, Maya's reflection shouldn't have existed in the first place. And since the camera is seeing what the lens is picking up, you can't see the reflection. It's similar in bathrooms with tiled mirrors. But as Maya stood in front of that mirror, she knew something was wrong. She felt as though she'd stepped into a world that operated on its own rules. A world where shadows acted independently of their owners and reflections came to life. Just as she considered giving up hope of ever escaping the tiled bathroom, she remembered the plot of the fairy tale. Every step she took brought her closer to home. But it would be a long journey, and she would need all her strength to make it. The moral of the story is, don't talk to strangers, especially if they live in mirrors. This may seem like a simple, cautionary tale, but it raises important questions about the nature of identity. When meeting new people, it's important to be cautious and protect your personal information. But why should you avoid sharing personal details with strangers? Well, firstly, not everyone has good intentions. Some people may use your information to scam or exploit you, while others may simply not care about your privacy. By being cautious, you reduce the risk of falling victim to these individuals. Secondly, once you share information, you lose control over who has access to it. Even if you trust the person you share your details with, there's no guarantee that they will take the same level of care as you. They could, for example, accidentally share your information with someone else, who then shares it with someone else, and so on. Lastly, sharing personal information can have long-term consequences. Once your data is out there, it's difficult to remove and could be used against you in the future. It's essential to protect your privacy and security and avoid becoming a victim of identity theft or online scams. Remember, it's better to be safe than sorry. Thank you for watching. See you next time.